Gospel reading is a continuation of Jesus preaching his Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus doesn't mince words. He cuts right to the chase, naming some really, really big sins. Those sins are murder and adultery and bearing false witness. And he even sneaks in a little word about divorce. You might have also noticed how, if you've ever heard of a hellfire and brimstone preacher, Jesus is living that out today too, making us aware that these big, big sins make us liable to the fires of hell. Maybe as you were hearing that reading, or perhaps the first hearers of the reading started to feel a little uncomfortable, maybe a little frightened, or even wanting to scream. And Jesus intentionally is doing this in his preaching, making the people a little uncomfortable. But at the same time, these words he is preaching to them, this truth he is speaking to them, shouldn't have come as a big surprise. Now I'll pause for a minute to make mention of these pictures on the screen, a little bit for comedic sake, of course. But on the left, we had recently taken a trip to Disney World as a family. And in our time at Epcot, we spent a little bit of time enjoying an art exhibit. It allowed us to enter into famous paintings. And so the picture on the right is a reenactment of Edvard Munch's famous painting, The Scream. So perhaps that connects that picture with you. At one point, I was able to enter the picture, the famous painting, and be the Mona Lisa. It was pretty fun. But of course, you go to theme parks not just for some of these fun experiences, but of course for the rides. And so on the left is a picture taken that is automatically a part of many of the roller coasters or thrill rides that happen at places like Disney World. And even though I look somewhat terrified in the picture, truth be told, this was the third time I was on this experience. It's called Expedition Everest. Maybe you've been on it. It has a big Yeti that's supposed to scare you. At one point you go up and then you go backwards down the roller coaster. Well, my family had figured out where the camera was located, and we challenged each other to make the most terrified face at that point in the ride. Well, the irony is that we got some good pictures, but the real terror happened just a little bit later because the roller coaster broke down. And we were stuck in a rather precarious position and eventually evacuated. So even though we were trying to show how scared we were, the real moment of fear came a little bit later. Now, when we go to a theme park or we board on a roller coaster or a thrill ride, we know what we're getting in for. We know that there'll be twists and turns and drops and unexpected things along the way. And so you're strapped in. You're kept safe so you can enjoy the ride. Well, for Jesus in his preaching, as he was speaking to the crowd that had gathered that day, he was reminding them of what was strapping them in to keep them safe. Even though his words likely were a bit troubling and unsettling, the people knew these words. They knew them as the Torah, the law, the 10 Commandments. So when Jesus lifts up murder, he's referring to the 5th commandment, you shall not kill. And when Jesus is talking about not committing adultery, the people know this. It's the 6th commandment. You shall not commit adultery. And as for the way in which we speak, our words and our language, well, again, the people understood this to be the 8th commandment. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, we had a flashback to the place in which God's people received that word, those 10 commandments, in our reading from Deuteronomy this morning. Here we have Moses himself addressing God's people to remind them that God has set before them life and prosperity and death and adversity. And Moses says, choose life. Live by these boundaries, these commands, so that you may have life. Certainly in this time, God's people were not making good choices, and of course the commandments were set up so that community might flourish, relationships among one another as well as with God might be blessed. Now, fast forward to Jesus and his preaching. Again, mentioning these commandments would stir up memories of that history among God's people. And so he says, "You have heard that it was said." In other words, again, you know this. But at the same time, it seems that the people have started to perhaps accuse one another of various sins, those big sins, and Jesus wants to get their attention. So he stretches out, he pushes the extreme, he creates a hyperbole that is so exceptional, perhaps it might even be a little bit ridiculous. So he says, "Are you angry with your brother or your sister? Have you called someone, you fool? Well, know that you will be judged for this. In fact, you should go straight to prison for that and not even look back. Oh, and as for committing adultery, well, maybe you've not divorced someone, but perhaps you have had a wandering eye that has noticed that someone is pretty easy on the eyes. Well, guilty. You have committed adultery. That's called lust. And you are guilty if you've had any thought like that." And then when it comes to our language, what do we say? How is it that we speak? Do we speak well of others? Do we perpetuate gossip or lies? And when it comes to swearing against God, guilty. Your words should simply be yes, yes, and no, no. Well, Jesus is setting up before us what seems to be an impossible situation, because if we're honest, we know that we have committed these little sins as well. In other words, Jesus is saying, get real. I know what is in your heart. I know the ways in which these commandments get broken all the time. I recently was introduced to a new app for my phone. The app is called BeReal. Now, maybe some of you are aware of this little tool, and in a world of social media, there's all kinds of things that you can get connected with. Well, as much as we live in that world of setting up that highlight reel on our Facebook account or Instagram account, BeReal is an app that is asking us to capture real, even boring moments in the day. My kids got me connected to it, and so I started to try it out. If you know how it works, suddenly at a random point in the day, you'll get an alert and you have 2 minutes to post the picture of where you are and what you are doing. So you get it out, you take a picture, and you get one of what you're doing and then where you are. So it takes 2 directions of pictures. Well, of course, being a bit of a rule follower, when I first put this app on my phone, I was immediately like, I have 2 minutes. Okay, so brushing my teeth, great. Take a picture, brushing my teeth, get the mirror, all is good. Or perhaps I was shoveling snow, picture of shoveling. Just ordinary daily activities. But truth be told, I only have 7 friends on my BeReal account. Why? Because I really only want 7 people, and they're all in my family, to see me that real. Not perfect hair and makeup, not doing extraordinary things, just being normal every day. And I also learned that you don't have to post in 2 minutes. You can post later in the day. So you actually can orchestrate a picture that perhaps represents your life, your real life in that moment. Why is it so hard for us to just be real, to live authentically? Jesus understands this struggle. Jesus wants us to be real, not so that we can be afraid of the consequences, but rather so we might know our need for God's grace. And it's an abundant grace indeed. For Jesus in his preaching today shakes us out of those places that we feel we can control, or perhaps even kid God in what we are or are not doing, and remember the purpose of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. That Jesus has taken all of that sin and shame and guilt to the cross so that we might live lives that are freed to serve, freed to live fully in the grace God has given to you and to me. Remember last week in Jesus' preaching, he said, I have come not to abolish the law and the prophets. The law has its place. The commandments have their purpose in orderliness and in building up community. But I have come to fulfill the law and the prophets. Jesus acts on our behalf, taking on that guilt and shame, going to the cross for you and me, means that we can live lives freed and forgiven. It gives us a bounce in our step, a joy in our heart, a peace that is everlasting, and the freedom to serve, knowing that even if we make mistakes, knowing we will make mistakes, God's grace is abundantly poured out for us, so that we may choose life and live it abundantly. Because we have a God who has chosen to give us that life, to set before us prosperity, to set before us blessings, so that we might fill a world in need with light and point to not God's judgment, but rather God's grace. Perhaps shaken a bit by this morning's reading, let you be clear in knowing this. You are forgiven. You are freed. You are sent into the world this day to bear that light of Christ to others. Shine brightly, live fully, live boldly, and know that God's grace and love will always be enough for you. Amen.